Good morning. It's great to see everyone here this morning. Those of you that showed up for Bible class, you know that we sprung forward, so welcome to springing forward in daylight savings time. It's great to see those who are members of this congregation, but we want to especially welcome those who are visiting. If you're visiting here today, we're so glad that you can be with us, and we hope that you come back again. Travis is out of town this week, and so I'm preaching this morning, and this evening at 5 p.m., Scott Young will be speaking. So we hope that you come back for that. If you have your Bible this morning, I'd ask you open it to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. As you're turning there, I'm going to show you a couple of quotes that might get your attention. You probably won't like what they have to say. They're not new. You probably heard these quotes before, but they're the kind of thing that just get your attention. Ted Turner, the media mogul, this is an old quote, but he said it years ago. He said, "Christianity is a religion for losers." Does that get your attention? Another quote. Yes, that was the appropriate animation for that slide. Jesse Ventura. Organized religion is a sham and a crutch for weak-minded people who need strength in numbers. It tells people to go out and stick their noses in other people's business. Christianity is for losers. Christianity is a sham for weak-minded people. It's not uncommon for people of the world to say that Christianity is for losers. Some believe it's a crutch for the weak-minded. Others say other things. I would say this in response. It maybe shouldn't surprise us because Jesus, when he came to seek the lost, where did he go? He went to go talk to those who probably the world considered to be losers. So when the world sees it this way, I suppose it shouldn't surprise us. But when we look at the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ, no one can read and really understand the life of Jesus and think that he was a loser. No one could look at the writings of the Apostle Paul that we'll look at this morning and say that Paul was a loser. In fact, Paul was somebody that talked a lot about being a winner. He talked a lot about focusing on being a winner. In fact, Paul is somebody that it seems really liked athletics because he made a lot of references to training as an athlete. I think of Jason and what he said at the Lord's Supper this morning and knowing what it takes to train somebody who's a runner. There's so much to that. But what I do know is this, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and you'll recognize that our theme for this year is from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, but I want to begin in verse 23, because Paul gives the reason for all of this in verse 23. He says, "I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it." Everything he does, there's a reason for it. All of it is for the sake of the gospel. And I want to be a partaker of it. That's what Paul says. Paul is not aimless. He's not vague in his approach. He has a singular goal. He has a singular focus. And he's concerned in what he writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that if we don't maintain that focus, we could actually be disqualified and not win the race. Let's read our text for this morning, beginning in verse 24. He says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we receive an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I preach to others, I myself will not be disqualified. The theme for this year that the elders have talked about, and we're going to try to talk about it more often this year, is the idea that we are focused on running this race to win, and realizing that that's not something that just happens. And so what I'd like to do this morning is briefly talk a little bit about this passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And then at the end of the lesson, on behalf of the elders, just share a few things that we want to make sure that we're working on together as a family here at the church in Clovis to make sure that we are running to win. And so let's begin by taking a look at verse 24. The first thing is the obvious point that is our theme. And that is, if you're going to run to win, you need to run in such a way that you may win. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Now, you might hear a common saying that we would talk about today with athletics, and it's a good saying. It's something along the lines of this. It's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game, right? And that's a well-intentioned quote, and it's something that we mean is the character and all those things. But I also want to flip it around for just a moment and imagine that I was on the sidelines of the Super Bowl next to the San Francisco 49ers after the game, and I went up to them and said, "Hey guys, remember, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you played the game. Good job, guys." I think I would have had some footballs and equipment thrown at me if I said that. They probably would have said, "Paul, we were here to win. We came on this field with every intention of winning." Any champion, whatever sport it is, people put all the work into this. Their focus was winning. Paul's emphasis in this verse is on that last statement. We should run our race in such a way. That means there is a way to do this. In the Christian race, we don't compete with one another for the prize. We compete with ourselves. And so what we're really talking about here is there's some self-discipline involved. Now, I'm not a runner. Anytime I talk about something I haven't done very much, I know like Jason Lenow's in the audience saying, "Okay, that's a runner." I'm not. But a number of years ago, finally made the commitment to say, I want to run a half marathon. And if you ever see a book out there that says, 3 easy steps to run a half marathon, don't buy it. Don't buy it. They're not telling the truth. But one thing I do know is this, and at least for me, that finally got me to do it, was you have to have a plan to do it. It's not like you're just going to walk out the door and say, I think I'll run a half marathon. And so I downloaded an app, and the app said, hey, all you have to do is day 1, run 15 minutes. 15 minutes? I can do that. Day 2, run 20 minutes, and so forth. And slowly over time, with a focus, it prepared you. And so the same thing is true with our faith. The same thing is true with the race that we run. You have to have a plan, and so many times we don't run with any aim. And aimless running is not a mark of Christian integrity. And so we want to focus our efforts on running in such a way that we may win. The second thing we know when it comes to running the race of faith is that in verse 25, it talks about there's some self-control involved. There is some training involved. He says everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we receive an imperishable. Now, when we talk about athletic contests, Paul was very familiar, and the Corinthians were very familiar with athletic contests. Nearby Corinth, there was a games. It was second to the Olympic Games called the Isthmian Games. And they were held right there on that little isthmus between Corinth, right next to Corinth there. And this was a huge area, but this was right next to Corinth. And so when they talked about this was something that they were very familiar with. It was every 2 or 3 years. In fact, it was biennially. It was in honor of Poseidon. It was second to the Olympics. And what's interesting is today they've even found some of the starting blocks from the races around the area, so they can still see this. So some historians have even thought Paul might have been around or even seen these games. We don't know that for a fact. But when Paul talked about races, when he talked to the Corinthians about this, they knew all about racing. They knew all about this because this was going on in this competitive race. And so when he talks about this, he talks about not just the race, but he talks about the training. He also talks about what they receive. And at the end, we know this, just like in now it's probably, we receive a gold medal. Back then, they would receive literally a perishable wreath. And this was the prize. And we know this in history. This is something that we've seen. But it took a lot of training. It took a lot of self-control to train for this race. In fact, to even participate in the Isthmian Games, you had to have been training for at least 10 months, minimum, usually more. And so Paul knew that self-control training was something that was important. Back in 1988, I had the privilege of attending the Winter Olympic Games in my hometown of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And seeing that was amazing, but seeing the events and talking to some of the athletes, I remember watching the ski jump, and that year there was a British ski jumper who barely could jump. They made a movie about him. His name was Eddie the Eagle, they called it. He was kind of a celebrity, and it was painful to watch him jump because he barely could land. He was interviewed, and they said, 9 times out of 10 when I jump, my glasses fog up and I can't see where I'm going. He had these real thick glasses. But on the flip side, the gold medalist was this guy named Matti Nikkanen. He was a Finnish ski jumper, and today he's probably known as one of the greatest ski jumpers that ever lived. And he would jump off that, and it was literally, he was an eagle. I mean, watching him was smooth, and there was 80,000 people watching this guy, and he broke records that year. And it was amazing to be there to see that. Well, they interviewed him afterwards, and you wonder, how did he get to be so successful? And so they talked to him, and he said, in preparation, he had trained almost every day, for the last several years. And well, how many practice jumps per day? He said probably about 60 jumps per day. About 60 jumps per day. And so we know in athletics, there's no easy way. It takes sacrifice. It takes work. The same is true in the Christian race. As Christians, we are to make living sacrifices. In Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, we learn, Paul writes more about that. Our whole life is supposed to be about self-control, about a sacrifice. We need to keep ourselves mentally prepared as well. Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15 talks about renewing our minds. We talk about our Bible reading, our Bible meditation, our Bible studies here at this church, all of those things. It's about renewing our minds because we leave this place and we're distracted by things that get us off of what our focus is. So Paul says we need to renew our minds. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, he also talks about how we should be continually growing and learning, the writer of Hebrews. He says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God. And you can come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil." Practice, focus, determination. I heard the story in working in human resources of 2 people that had the chance for a promotion. One person had worked at the company for 25 years. He thought, the promotion is mine. The other person had been there for only 1 year. Based on those facts, you think it's obvious who's going to get the selection. The person with 1 year got the job. The person with 25 years was livid. They said, "Why? I've been here 25 years. I've given my life to this company. Why did I not get that promotion?" And the boss sat down and he looked at him and he said, "You have not had 25 years. You have had 1 year 25 times. You haven't grown. You haven't done anything else beyond what happened in that first year." And sometimes with Christianity, we see the same thing can be true. As Christians, there's so many areas of training and self-control to focus on. And I ask you this morning, how is your daily Bible reading, study, or meditation to renew your mind? How is your prayer life this morning? How is your attendance at worship and Bible study? Our ability to take what we read in the Bible and put it into practice. What we watch, listen to, and say shows whether we are self-controlled. Husbands loving their wives, wives respecting their husbands, fathers as spiritual leaders in their homes rather than being apathetic as many are. All of these things are areas of training and self-control. And then Paul goes on in verse 25 and he compares the eternal to the temporary. He says, really, if these athletes were prepared to exercise such self-control for the perishable prize, don't we need to dedicate even more for the eternal prize? Now, what they received at the time was a wreath of parsley, wild celery, or pine. That's what it was made of. If you went to the Olympic Games, it was a wild olive wreath. If you think about flowers that you've received and you see those things dying after about a week, this thing would be disintegrating very soon. So when they heard this, they knew exactly what Paul was talking about. We're looking at something eternal. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11 tells us God has placed eternity in our hearts. He created us with a space in our souls that can't be satisfied without something of everlasting duration. He also said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, we flip over there real quick. He said, "For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." What Paul's saying is, for all the work that these athletes put in for this wreath that will disintegrate in a week, won't you put in the work for the eternal glory that's in store for us? In Romans chapter 8, verse 22 and 23, he said, "For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. Not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body." Everything within us yearns for that spiritual place. D. Bowman said it best, just if you miss heaven, you just missed it all. It's worth the sacrifice. Heaven is described in the Bible, and we can't imagine how glorious it is, but it takes focus to get there. Speaking of focus, Paul goes on in verses 26 and 27, and he basically says, be careful that you don't lose focus and become disqualified. In view of the comparative value of these rewards, Paul ran this race purposely, not aimlessly, not half-heartedly, not just going through the motions. He was focused. To use a different figure of speech on the same point, he said basically it's like he doesn't throw wild punches or punch in the air, but he was trying to actually land a punch. He was going to be focused. Do we get distracted in the Christian race? I saw this clip of a runner, and you can't see it very well, but the guy at the front is nearing the finish line. His hands are going up. What is he doing? He's celebrating, right? This guy's about to win. He is almost to the finish line. Can you see what's about to happen? As he's raising his hands, he doesn't see there's somebody coming right behind him. Uh-oh. He notices about that moment that he made a mistake, and he loses the race. And the commentator said he'll never make that mistake ever again. Sometimes as Christians, we lose focus. We're not paying attention to what we're doing. We're even talking about what we should be doing, but we're not doing it. I had to laugh at this clip. Some of you might have seen this. The coronavirus is no laughing matter, but a public health director in a county was up speaking. You might have seen this. It was on social media. And she went up and goes, well, today, start working on not touching your face. And you see this? And then she says, well, because, one main way that virus is spread is when you touch your own mouth, nose, or eyes. Now let me turn my page. She didn't even notice that she did it. Friends, sometimes in the church we do the same thing. We talk about these things, we say these things, we become so, maybe even we're not even thinking about the practical application of it. Are we going through the motions? We don't want to lose focus and become disqualified. Christian service is not just an activity, it's an activity focused on a target. At the end of the day, we're talking about what Paul said in verse 23, and that's the gospel. Young people, it is said in churches across the nation, are leaving the church. And a lot of reasons they're leaving the church is because they will look at their parents or grandparents or the church and say, they're talking about these things, but they're not actually doing it in practical living every day. And that's a sad statement, because many have lost their focus. Paul is concerned himself that he remain focused when he writes this, because he says, after I preach to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Paul is concerned with himself. In running of the Christian race, what Paul is saying is, don't bail out. Don't give less than 100%. Think of those who are consumed with winning a race for just a moment of time, a moment of fame. We're talking about eternity with this. Paul wants to compare what it will be like to be welcomed into heaven someday. And so we yearn for these things. And he goes on in 1 Corinthians 10 to be careful that we don't think we stand, but fall. So he says in verse 26, I don't run aimlessly. I've got a focused goal. I don't run like I have no goal. And frankly, for Christians to live an aimless life is sad, because we have a focus. The Lord has given it to us. I heard one preacher say that many Christians remind him of a London bus company a number of years ago. They were striving for efficiency. They made it their goal to always be on schedule. No other bus route could rival their efficiency. Someone said, well, how did they do it? How did you keep such a tight schedule? Well, it seems that if they were ever in danger of not meeting their schedule, the drivers were simply instructed to simply not stop at bus stops, even if there were people waiting there for the bus. As you can imagine, that made some customers fairly angry, but the transit authority released a statement explaining why they always didn't pick up waiting passengers. It's impossible for us to maintain our schedule if we are having to stop to pick up passengers. I think they lost their focus, don't you? The same thing could happen for us. Finally, brethren, we want to maintain focus on running to win. Go back to the very beginning of verses 24 and 25. We have to run with a mind that is fixed on winning the prize. And so that means, some people get out, if anybody's a long-distance runner, if you get out and you sprint, you're not going to last very long. And many Christians are like that. They come out of the blocks all excited, and then they just run out of gas, and they don't have it all in them. You have to maintain that focus. Those who see Jesus as their Savior and King yearn for Him. Focus on that. You run like a prize winner, not half-heartedly, not because I want to get a t-shirt because I ran in this race, but because I want to compete. Speaking of compete, the word compete in this verse is from the Greek word, it's I probably can't say it correctly, agonizomai, which is from which we get the English word agony. To receive the prize is going to take all our effort. And that might sometimes be agonizing. We need self-control. An athlete in training denies himself or herself, and only real, practical, hard training can strengthen spiritual muscle. There's no shortcut to do that. Does it matter who you run with, by the way? Sometimes in a race, you'll see people get into clusters, and they're comparing themselves with the people that they're with. And so if you happen to be at the back, well, then you're going to be at the back. When we talk about running to win, at the very end of Paul's life. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul is in a phase where it's one of the last writings we have from him. And he writes a letter where he described his perspective. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning in verse 6, he says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. In the future there's laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Paul could say, I finished the course. He wasn't disqualified. He wasn't distracted. He kept focused on that area. And so in our own congregation, as we talk about running to win, I just want to leave you with a few thoughts that relate to our congregation here and some things that the elders want you to know about when it comes to running to win. In our communication with the deacons, our communication with the men in the men's business meeting last month, there's some things we want you to know. First, the elders. We want you to know we are available if you ever want to talk to us. We meet usually on the third Sunday evening of each month, but if you need to meet another time, if you want to talk to any one of us, we want you to know we are available to you. We want you to know that we are very blessed with 13 men who serve as deacons in this congregation. And we have the things that they do, I believe, posted in the back. But if you don't know, let us know. We'll give you a handout. So if you don't know who to go to, we have deacons who are doing things that often is unsung behind the scenes, and they should be commended for their efforts. There's so many things going on behind the scenes that make this congregation work, and frankly, it is part of our efforts to do it in a way that is first class, and we are very lucky and proud that they serve in this way. When it comes to the members of this congregation, we just want to share a few things about the last year and a few things about the new year. When we talk about the attendance at our church, and you've seen our numbers, our attendance has been pretty consistent. We'd like to see it continue to go back up. In some areas, it's trending down a little bit, but we have people coming and going. But what I'd say is this. Running to win, we'd like to see everybody here as much as possible. There's an opportunity tonight at 5 o'clock. There's opportunities for Bible study every week. We have a gospel meeting we'll talk about in a minute beginning next week. Be here for that. Make it a priority. Attending every opportunity you can is part of what makes this a priority in your life. And believe it, your children, your grandchildren, they look at us and ask. What we say is one thing, but what we do is another. So we'd like to see it be a priority that we are here. There's other things that we are excited about that we're doing in 2020, and we'll give you more information about that. We've got Service Saturday dates coming up. We've got Invite a Friend Sundays that are scheduled where we can talk to others about the gospel. We had one last month. We had a prayer meeting yesterday. We have another one in September. We're trying to create opportunities where we can come together and pray together. We'll have opportunities to sing with the saints where we can sing with others who may not be able to be here with us. We'll be having a summer home Bible study series like we did last year to study the Word together, but also to spend more time together. Song training. We're fortunate to have some good song leaders, but we want more with our young men to learn about this. And so February 23rd, we had one. April 26th, after the Sunday evening service. This is something new we haven't done. Song training. 5th Sunday devotional service. 2nd Sunday singing. So I want to point out, you may wonder, okay, that's great, Paul, but that's a lot to keep track of. All of these things are on our website, and so if you have a login, if you don't, one of our deacons, Joe's in the back, you can talk to him about that, and we can get you set up for a login. Steve, one of our elders, puts every event in here so you can see on the calendar, click on that link, and everything that's going on is on that calendar. We want you to be aware of these things. We want you to participate in these things. There's a lot of things happening we want you to know. We are very excited about some of the events that are coming up beginning next week with Mike Wilson. Mike Wilson is going to be here, and you know he's talking about how we got the Bible. Mike is passionate about this subject. It's something I'm very excited about. We'd like to see you here. We'd like to see your children here. We'd like to see your grandchildren here. We'd like you to invite people to be here. There's a bunch of flyers still in the back. We'd like to see them gone. And there's a chance to hand out some flyers on Saturday. Later this year, we've got Brent Willey coming, and guess what he's speaking about? Running to win. And if you've heard Brent before, you know Brent is a passionate speaker, and we are excited about that. Vacation Bible School this year is on the theme, running the race of faith. Everything we're doing is going to be reminding us of how important this is and focusing on this. You know that we support preachers around the world. We're going to get you more information about that from bios and what they're doing in our bulletin, and so you can know exactly what's happening. These are the men that we support in the Philippines, Mexico, South Africa, and the United States. One thing that is a great encouragement to us, you can see where they are around the world, is that last year there were 55 baptisms at these places. I didn't mention we had 11 baptisms in this congregation last year. We want to see even more, but these efforts are things that are bearing fruit in our efforts. A few specific areas that I'd like to leave you with, and then the lesson will be yours. The elders have talked a lot about how we need to integrate our theme into everything we do, and so we'll be talking a lot more about this and keeping our focus on what it means to run to win. And so we'll continue to return to that through the year. We're going to try to put more articles and focus in the bulletin that are not just on the theme, but also by our own members, our own preachers, elders, and men that we support. And so you'll see more about that coming in future bulletins in ways to further edify the congregation. We've heard feedback, and we're going to implement other effective ways to teach God's Word. From a conversation or a text talk similar to what we've seen at a congregation that Max Dawson preaches at, to elders and other young men guest speaking, we're looking forward to more ways to share God's Word with you. We've heard some feedback that when we talk about the financial needs of the congregation, we know we put the contribution and we put the budget, but that doesn't really talk about the true financial needs of the congregation. We have both short-term and long-term needs, not just physically but spiritually, when it comes to the goals of this congregation. So you'll hear more about that in the coming months as to what those goals are and how we can support that. Again, that's with the goal of running to win and spreading the gospel in this area and abroad. And the last thing I want to leave you with is one that is of self-reflection for the elders, but we'd like to challenge others to join us in this effort, and that is, we realize that hospitality is one of those things that is becoming a lost art, isn't it? I feel like everyone I talk to says, hey, when we were younger, we would go every Sunday afternoon, somebody would invite us over, and we'd be in people's homes, and it just doesn't happen like it used to. And so as an eldership, we've challenged ourselves to do this even more than we have, but in particular, to do it with people we don't normally talk to do it with people, our newer members or people that we don't get to speak with. And so we'd like to challenge every member of the congregation. Invite someone over you don't normally spend time with. Talk to someone you don't normally spend time with. Have lunch with them. Have them in your home. And get to know them to establish that personal connection. There are so many more things that we could talk about this morning, but my time is limited, and so I will just end by saying this. Our goal personally is to keep our focus on winning that race. And we are so distracted by things of this world. This morning, if you're here and you haven't even begun the race, if you're looking at it, it only takes one step. And although it takes hard work to keep focus, Jesus has already made it easy for us to take that first step. Once we believe that He is who He said He is, and we can have firm faith in that, we confess that we believe that He is the Son of God that He claimed to be. We repent. We put our old life aside and we say, I'm going to live God's way, not my way. And then we're immersed in baptism, and we come up out of that water with our sins forgiven. There's a baptistry right there. We've had some baptisms recently that were very exciting. If you haven't started the race, why don't you start this morning? What's stopping you? If you're here this morning and you haven't been giving your best, maybe you've been distracted. Maybe you haven't been running the race as you should, and you want the prayers of this congregation and you want encouragement. If you're subject to that invitation, won't you come to the front right now as together we stand and sing.